Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability and Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bebbington.
Jan, today we're going to move on from the overviews that we've done both of the Centre and the Centre's overall work of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and we're going to look on a specific topic. And what's that topic today, Jan?
It's business and biodiversity. So today we're going to think about biodiversity with a very special guest.
Yes, it's not just going to be us talking about biodiversity. We've got with us someone who used to work for Nestlé. He's worked for the WWF. Unfortunately, I was to discover not the World Wrestling Federation,
Wow.
which people of my age, will have automatically have thought of at the time, rather the Worldwide Fund for Nature. He's worked for Shell. He's worked as a forester, and he's worked across the corporate sector, all around issues to do with biodiversity and sustainability. It is Honorary Professorial Fellow Duncan Pollard. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you very much.
I suppose we've introduced you briefly there, but do you want to give us a rundown of your background, your expertise around business biodiversity?
I started out life as a forester, so that always starts with nature and the long term and thinking about the future. I worked for 20 years in the forest industry around the world, and then flipped into the NGO world, into WWF, as you said, where biodiversity is I think fundamental to what they're doing. Nature, Worldwide Fund for Nature is there, and biodiversity being part of that. And I worked for 10 years at WWF in the forest program, but then looking after all of their thematic work, so species and energy, forests, freshwater, oceans, and all of the policy work. And then I moved back to the corporate world and moved to Nestlé as essentially head of sustainability, sitting within the operations function, driving changes to the way that the company operated through its sourcing of materials and manufacturing and supply of those products through to customers. And right now I have a portfolio of work which keeps me in the sustainability area, working on climate change and food loss and waste and other things as well. So that's about me.
I think I commented in the previous episode, Jan, that Duncan seems to do more while he's retired than most people do. Myself, maybe just myself. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush.
I try not to say I'm retired, but...
Most retirees I know have no idea how they ever went to work. So many things to do.
I guess then the question is, how did your connections with the Pentland Centre come about?
Well, they came about while I was at Nestlé originally, because we were faced with a situation 5 or 6 years ago, actually on climate change, with an initiative which started through the G7. Angela Merkel asked the world's central banks to determine what their resilience would be under various scenarios of different scenarios of climate change. And that led to an initiative called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And that trickled down to companies who were then asked, initially voluntarily, but increasingly now more as a full requirement of reporting, to report upon the impact that climate change would have upon the company. This was completely new thinking required for us, and we approached the Pentland Centre, who were able to bring together experts on agriculture, experts on climate change, and experts on accounting. And it was through that, and through Jeffrey Unerman particularly, who gave us all of the insights to understand how we might go about understanding, assessing, and then reporting upon the impacts from the outside in to the company. So before that, companies had always reported and still report upon the impact they're having upon climate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but this was how are changes in the climate going to impact the company.
I might ask you to reflect on how Nestlé is affected by biodiversity, so how it depends on it, but also what impacts it might have upon it. Because many people listening to this podcast will maybe see Nestlé as a brand on what they're buying, but they might not fully understand what the company does and how it has that nature connection.
Obviously, it's a big food company. I like to say it's maybe a little bit simplistic, but you can pretty much assume that it's buying every commodity from every country. And when we did the calculations in two different ways, the area of land that it depends upon to source all of those agricultural commodities is about 2.5 times the size of Switzerland. So it is huge in terms of the land area required to grow the crops, or actually all the seafood as well that it uses, and all the wood for the paper and the packaging that's required. So suddenly you start to say, well, okay, where is that land? Well, it's all over the place. It depends upon the commodities that you're using. So palm oil is an obvious one and a famous one that companies are under huge scrutiny about in terms of biodiversity impacts. But they're big buyers of milk, and therefore there's big areas of dairy and grazing that's needed, and cocoa and coffee and all of those. So they're sourcing commodities from a variety of countries, a variety of different landscapes, different biospheres, if you like, and biomes, if you like. So in addition to that, there's all of the services that nature provides. The most obvious one is pollination. So that all of the crops that require wild pollination by insects and bees and to make the crops grow, and clean water and those kind of things. So we understood quite well the dependency that we had upon nature and the impact as well. The reporting that we did perhaps best illustrates that. It was traditional and is still traditional to report upon biodiversity to the Global Reporting Initiative around the sites, the operations that a company has. And for Nestle then, there's more than 400 factories around the world. Each of those factories is located in a place that may or may not have high levels or low levels of biodiversity. First of all, you've got to understand that. And then the way that we interpreted that was actually that some of those factories will be dependent upon clean water coming from upstream. And therefore, there's a huge interest in knowing how are those landscapes upstream managed in order to ensure that the water continues to be clean for the future. And by the same token, whatever discharges the factory has a potential impact downstream. So there's this geographical connection that you might think of a factory as a defined site, but it's connected into the landscape. And that's quite aside from the sourcing of materials, whether that's coffee or cocoa or dairy or palm oil or sugar or whatever, and how those are grown and the impact that those have. So that's really the way that we started to understand and think about nature.
So you mentioned there the fact that it's been traditional to report on this. Are there regulations within the reporting? Are there things that need to be done that have to be reported on? Or is it a free-for-all?
Look, there are two ways that traditionally there's been reporting by companies. Even aside the financial reporting, which we can come on to in a moment, the sustainability level reporting has really been driven by the Global Reporting Initiative that I mentioned. That's a voluntary system, although being voluntary, it's been taken up by pretty much every major company, and therefore it almost becomes the standard that companies are judged against. But as I said and indicated, the way the Global Reporting Initiative requires you to report upon biodiversity is very much dependent upon the location of company assets. So in the case of a Nestle, it would be a factory. In the case of a Rio Tinto or a Shell, it's the oil field or the location of the mine. It doesn't ask for that broader supply chain reporting, nor does it ask for the impacts that the products that the company makes might have upon the environment. The second way that companies, I would say for close to 20 years now, 15 or 20 years have been reporting is through the CDP, formerly called the Climate Disclosure Project, now just the CDP. The CDP started out as a voluntary way for companies to report on climate. Again, whilst it's voluntary, it's become the norm for big companies to report upon that. So it's almost a requirement, if you like. That expanded to cover water, and then it expanded to cover forests. And so forests became the proxy for reporting on biodiversity for many companies, especially those involved in the land use or having anything to do with timber or paper or so on. Now, I think the interesting thing about CDP is that most companies, when they're preparing their annual report or their sustainability report, reference CDP, but they reference the score they get in CDP. They don't actually give details of their reporting to CDP. And I can assure you there are thousands and thousands of lines of answers of questions that CDP requires. So there's a wealth of let's say, reporting to CDP that gets kind of hidden in the system that the you or I, if we wanted to find it, is incredibly difficult. CDP, in fact, synthesize all of that into their reports. So it's not actually possible. There's not much transparency in that reporting, if you like, for any individual who wants to scrutinize what a company is doing or not doing.
What the CDP does do, I know because I paid them a lot of money, is that you can buy the data.
Yes, okay.
So as researchers,
so it's a business.
Yeah, it is a business model. So as a researcher, you can buy the data, and you're right, there's this most amazing information in there that you don't see in the public domain. But also CDP's owners, if you like, and the people that are producing the information for are investors. And so they use that information to make the evaluations they might make as quite sophisticated financial owners to, do they like a firm or not like the firm. So I think you're right, the person in the street will never see that data, but the guys that are buying and selling shares in companies, presumably, although it's hard to tell, are looking at that data in some shape or form.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's why I said presumably.
I did once spend a little bit of time looking at a Bloomberg terminal, and indeed the Bloomberg terminal has the CDP score, but it's almost, has it reported to CDP or hasn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if someone who's making a quick decision about to press a button on buying a trunk of shares is actually really looking at the difference between an A+ or a B- on CDP, but it may well be looking at, has it reported to CDP or not?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right.
Bearing that in mind, is there a way of being able to distinguish what is good reporting, what is bad reporting? Is there a way to assess these reports in the way they're submitted easily to know if a company's doing a good job of the way it is analysing itself and its activities and its impacts? That's
a little bit coming on to what we're doing at the Pentland Centre. Going back to how I first got to know the Pentland Centre and this work to understand the impact of climate change upon companies, the next thing that's coming along is on nature. So we have the Task Force on Nature-related financial disclosures, which is saying that all the evidence shows that the status of nature and biodiversity is going down. So then the question is, so what does that mean for companies? And that's then the entry point for us here to start to look at what would good reporting look like. And so for the last 2 years, Jan and I have been looking at 20 or so companies, global companies, across all of the different sectors that are either dependent upon or potentially impact nature and biodiversity, and so we cover mining and oil and gas and seafood and forestry and food and clothing, utilities, and we're looking at trying to understand what would good reporting look like, and how would we move from not just kind of a reporting to the current and the future standards that are out there, but more to try and get behind that and see whether companies have an understanding. How deep is that understanding? I mean, it's one thing to report. Reporting's fine, but actually we need to know or understand the companies themselves? Are they understanding their dependency? Are they understanding the status of the nature and biodiversity around them? Are they understanding their dependency upon that? Are they understanding the impact that they're making? And are they understanding the changes such as climate change, pollution, invasive species, land use change, all of these drivers of the change of biodiversity? Are they understanding that? Are they understanding how technology, how government policies, how markets are changing and how that impacts upon that? So that's what we're trying to understand. So yes, it is possible to start to differentiate between the good and the bad.
On a similar vein then, is it possible to compare companies working in totally different areas, in totally different sectors, and the quality of their reporting? Because presumably some companies are going to be having a much more obvious externally, such as mining, such as deforestation impact on the environment than others.
So let's take two examples. Let's take the mining industry and the food industry. The mining industry, even if you take the biggest companies, they've got, 20, 30, 40 mines, locations around the world where they are intersecting with or interacting with or potentially impacting nature. The guidance that's out there suggests, and I think I agree with this, that it's hard to say that mining industries have a dependency upon nature, or at least a material dependency upon nature. They certainly have a material impact or potential impact upon nature. And so how you look and analyze the mining industry is clearly going to be different to the food industry and the example that I gave you of Nestle, which is sourcing from a huge geographical area, huge geographical footprint, and with production processes that can vary widely and differently in terms of the impact that they have.
For our listeners, I might say something about materiality, because that really matters in a company context when you're trying to decide, you might have many impacts, but which ones really matter. So materiality is a way of figuring out the ones that really matter, as opposed to things like impacts that are there but aren't as important as other impacts. So it's a really crucial characteristic of information, but also for action. Is it material? And you might say, is it material to the natural environment? Is it material in a financial sense? Is it material in a social sense? So materiality is a really big topic to understand, and a really technical and practical topic to understand in the field. I might perhaps move on and sort of think about the analogy of some of our listeners that might have their shopping bag and they've got their things in it. And so if you even start to think about my shopping bag and thinking about how would I know where all of these resources came from, not just who picked them, but where were they grown, how were they transported, etc. My mind sort of explodes at that point in terms of the absolute volume of data that you need. How does a big company with 400 factories, how do you deal with that data requirement that sits behind knowing what your impact on nature is and knowing what your dependencies on it are?
Let's take an example of coffee, but we could say any commodity, but coffee. You can go into your local coffee shop or supermarket and you can find on the shelf Ethiopian coffee. Colombian coffee. In order to be able to make that claim that it's from Colombia, they need to know.
Yes.
They have to be able to prove that. If you then look and buy some instant coffee, and I won't name any brands, but you know them all, they're not saying where that coffee's from. So it's a mixture. The blend may well come from 2 or 3 or 4 places. If you're a company like Nestle and you've got a coffee factory in Mexico that's using coffee from Mexico, you pretty much know your farmers because you're buying from them. But if you're a coffee factory in Spain, you're importing coffee from all over the place. You're probably buying through complex supply chains with 2 or 3 intermediaries in between. That gets harder. And the trick, of course, is then, how much time and effort do you put into mapping those supply chains? For coffee, there's been an awful lot of effort put into that because it's one of those commodities that is under huge scrutiny by consumers. They need to know there's known issues around the sourcing, and in order to be able to demonstrate that the practices are of a good standard, then time and effort is put into it. But if you think of some other kind of globally traded commodities like wheat, you're buying wheat for bread, and this year it might come from Ukraine, next year it might come from Canada, the year after it might come from Australia. There's a tendency by, there's a certain quality requirement that's required, but there's a certain price. And the growth and the productivity may well be different in different countries, and therefore you're buying on the market. Because there's this constant change, that's when it gets harder to actually have the traceability and know exactly where it's come from. And so if you want traceability, it pretty much forces you to get closer to the growers. And one example I will use, and it's not releasing anything that's confidential because I think that the big companies like Unilever and Mars and Nestle have said it all publicly. When they started seriously having to map their supply chains of sourcing palm oil in order to make a commitment to zero deforestation. So you make a zero deforestation commitment, you have to know where your palm oil is coming from. And for most companies, that's been a more than 10-year journey to map out understanding through very complex supply chains, probably 2, 3, 4 tiers of suppliers, where it's coming from. As you said, Jan, the volume of data required is huge. The way to manage that has been by actually reducing the number of suppliers. So all of those companies that I mentioned previously had thousands of. Once they figured out where is it coming from, and they realized there were thousands of different places, and if price and quality is how you're determining this, then who you're buying from today is different from who you were buying from yesterday. Well, that's no longer good enough if you need to be able to demonstrate zero deforestation. And so they've all now got less than 200, maybe even less than these days, maybe even less than 100 suppliers. Mm-hmm. So they've had to change the way that the procurement function works in order to be able to demonstrate that traceability.
It sounds though like there has been a lot of progress made. Lots of progress has been made in recent years. Do you see that progress continuing? Can you see that it's continuing to build towards a more positive future with regards to what's going on with companies, their biodiversity reporting, their actions with regards to this?
Yeah, I looking at the reporting this year, it is interesting, and it reflects exactly what we've just been talking about. There will be more scrutiny. I mentioned before TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. That will drive better disclosure by companies of their understanding of their dependency and impact upon nature. You start to see a lot of very interesting developments, companies partnering with academic institutions, starting to use technology, some AI-facilitated technology to understand biodiversity around them and monitor that biodiversity. You also start to see companies using nature in their branding as well. So you start to see all these threads that we've been talking about occurring. So in the climate area, it's fairly clear that there are some products, if you like, which are just not consistent with the climate emergency that we've got. Coal would be the great example, but we could talk about oil and gas as well. We haven't got that far with nature and biodiversity, but it's quite easy to speculate as to what those products and business models are that are contributing to nature. We haven't quite got that far, but you can predict that in a few years' time, if as the discourse on nature and biodiversity advances, that's where we'll get to.
And that point of speculation, I've now got many ideas racing around in my mind, which we might gossip about once this podcast is finished.
Speaking of, Jan, I mean, that's a great place to draw to a close. On a positive note, there's been not as much of the doom and gloom that you tend to bring to these proceedings in this particular episode, I'm afraid.
There was accounting, though, so
yes,
I'm happy.
Yeah, well, and that's the important thing, that we're happy we've covered accounting. That's it. Thank you very much, Duncan Pollard.
Thank you.
That's been really interesting, Jan, talking about business, biodiversity, the broad range of topics there, some of it tying in with supply chains to what we'll be discussing next week, when we'll have distinguished Professor Linda Hendry here with us to talk about modern slavery and all through the supply chains there. Really great topic to open up with when we're starting to look at the work that's going on in the Pentland Centre.
I agree, and I think we're already seeing some consistent messages. So the Sustainable Development Goals topics are coming through, but also consideration of traceability. I think that's going to keep us in mind for quite a bit of time. Also reporting, I think we'll see more of that as we go forward in the podcast. So I think that's our first big topic covered. There's lots to come back to there as well.
That's it for this episode of Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability and Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bibbington.